the early and the late Lacan.
Correct.
And so I think this is very helpful, and I suppose many of you join me in that feeling that one of the next steps that could have been taken off from the very late Lacan, which is a bit upside down from the early Lacan, and which left over many notions for us to play with or to reject, is of course the question of the feminine that could not endlessly be related to in terms of that which is not something. And perhaps even in a sense in our period right now, not only after the Corona crisis, but majorly after the digital media revolution, we can conceive even much more to what degree the question of relation or non-relation, or what is the non-sexual relation, or what could be another modus of sexuality, is so needed to help us have more conceptual tools to understand our own relationship in a world in which the name of the father collapsed. But the major collapse, even before the collapse of the name of the father, is, I believe, the collapse of the air, the ocean, the rivers, the earth, which were rejected under a certain signature of that which is maternal to be rejected. And so there was a huge, in my view, amalgam between respecting the earth and nationalism, or all kind of, we attacked nature, and we, in similar terms, that the maternal and the feminine have been either attacked or foreclosed or rejected or left as a split off. So even though I'm not going to concentrate a lot on the feminine in my, perhaps this will be for later on, because I would like first to put some notions which are Lacanian and which are difficult on the table and move from there, okay? So that's the program, and I need 1 minute to bring my material.
Let me do a formal introduction of Bracha Ettinger, just for folks less familiar with Bracha Ettinger's work. I want to share just some brief information about her background and her specialties. So Bracha is a psychoanalyst. She's a painter and also a Lacanian theoretician. She's a professor at the European Graduate School. Her painting and her theoretical work has been written about by major philosophers of our time, including Jean-Francois Lyotard, Judith Butler, Brian Masumi, and many others. She is a prominent painter in the French and the Israeli art scenes. She is also a war veteran and remains a committed activist and member in Physicians for Human Rights Israel, where she contributes to the organization as a clinical psychologist and attends Palestinian patients in needed areas in the Palestinian occupied territories. As a theoretician, Bracha has developed a number of innovative concepts in Lacanian thought, including the matrixial border space and a theory of trans-subjectivity. These theoretical contributions have transformed contemporary debates in art, psychoanalysis, women's studies, and cultural studies. Today's seminar is entitled Late Lacan and After, Humanizing Life Drive in the Age of Gaze, Screen Eyes Symbiosis. So there is a little introduction. Do you have your book now? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. We're very honored to have you, Bracha, for this encounter, this seminar, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's really my pleasure. I'll start with a little reminder of the Möbius stripe and the sphere, if you could see it, the sphere. And even the torus, which is here, which were all kind of ways for Lacan to bring to the fore the relations between the becoming, we can say it now, becoming subject at every minute, the becoming subject, and the object, whether present, whether lost. If the object is lost or lacking from the beginning, he would call it the object little a. And if the object is there, subject is not there. We know that these topological forms shows us surfaces in which if we move in the surface in the outside, we enter into the inside, we go out again into the outside. And at every moment, there is no possibility to say whether we are inside or outside. And the only possibility can appear when there is some kind of split that enters and cut the topological shape. And at that moment, we can say outside is here, inside is here. Love is here, hate is here, subject is here, object is here. But as long as we are moving along this topological shape, which let's take it as a shape in space and time, as we move along in time, in any time of telling the story or listening or connecting to one another, as long as we have not introduced a cut or an interpretation or a moment of revelation, it depends how we look at it, there is no way to position, to say this is up, this is down. And therefore, perhaps we understand that the intervention is not only pointing into that which is inside and outside, but also creating it. So if in the moment of interpretation, we are creating the traces that will belong to us, or the traces that will belong to the other or to the world, or imagining ourselves in the world, identify with the world of the subject in treatment, and realize what for him or her is belong to him or not, or lost from him. So we have to bring into account the huge extent under which our not even counter-transference, but our transference to the subject is crucial in the process, which puts us in a certain responsibility, even if we don't work with the transference and counter-transference. We recognize it. We don't necessarily work with it. So the favorite model for my analysis that I analyzed many times and continued is the object of the gaze, the relation between eye gaze and screen. But under different topological structures, we can relate to other objects as well. And famously for Lacan, we will have with the sphere the oral drive. With the torus, we will have the anal drive, right? With the gaze, we'll go to the klein bottle, and with the voice to the cross cup. But it is not necessarily so well defined, because what we have here is an attempt to imagine and to represent these unrepresentable notions of the direction, the centrifugal direction or the centripetal direction between object, lost object, and subjectivity in becoming. And we can be aware, if we follow the topological forms that Lacan chooses, that with the oral drive, probably he's trying to locate the passage from the outside to the inside without being able to separate them, or even seeing how they can reverse themselves. With the anal, we will have this possibility of thinking through the torus over time, a more direction of expulsion from the inside to the outside, which again can turn and change. And then it gets much more complex with the klein bottle and the cross cup, to which I'm going to refer to in a more specific way. So I will also present through that the question of what I called matrixial object A, matrixial link, matrixial border linking and border spacing, and especially if we have time, border swerving, which is very important in order to understand the relation of the subject to trauma. So in a more general way, the object A indexes absence of contact with the psychic originary thing, resulting from an incision from the other with the big O as body, or as the body of the mother, and I'm saying it quite immediately also, the mother M/big O, the archaic mother other, which evades the structures the moment a subjectivity is established. Engender the subject along a small number of unconscious dimensions. Vision is privileged among them. As a leftover of the activity of the scopic drive in the real, the object A is cleft from the subject as well as from the other. At the same time, the object is missing in me and missing in you. It is not just missing in the inside, but it is also missing for the outside to which I am relating. And it has no direct representation in the image. This is why Lacan needs topological figures. The split object A in the field of vision is the gaze, of course, G-A-Z-E. It is a remnant of the trajectory of the scopic drive, trying to reach for its objects, and in fact of the object trying to reach me. It is a leftover of inaccessible bodily sampling of my corporeality and of the other. For Lacan, this gaze, split from both the subject and the other, is a priori an absence, and on the level of the real, it's a libidinal loss. So what I will call a matrixial object A assumes that impossibility of total loss, the impossibility of a total other, if we are to humanize the human subject, then the point upon which we are establishing our basic assumption in psychoanalysis have to be examined. We have to examine death drive, which I hope to do today a little. We have to examine life drive even more than death drive in Freud to see how it all began. And we have also to put doubt in the basic structuring of subjectivity that established by Freud, continued by Lacan, in which the I establishes itself through the rejection of that which is not I. This is a Freudian definition, and Lacan follows on that. It is as if whatever it is that gives us a feeling of being or becoming is always connected to that move of splitting and rejective split. In the matrixial sphere, and talking about the feminine and relating it to the maternal and our own being separating in jointness from the archaic maternal figure and from the other at any moment, this kind of movement, therefore the model is not the newness of birth, which is then rejecting and accumulating leftovers, but rather the beginning of the subject have never been a new and totally either symbiotic or totally separated, or even not aspiring to total separation, I or subjectivity. So the matrixial object A, that sometimes I called it link A, and as I developed the theory, I followed this movement of border linking and border spacing of this relationship between subject and object, is a trail of separation in jointness. The incision is not possible. The incision from the archaic maternal in us is not possible. And castration, in the sense of even early Lacan and also late Lacan, is not the modus through which we can establish a subject, ourselves as subject, that takes into account the feminine. So it is not a trace of a lost object, but a link that ebbs and flows with the co-emergence and co-fading of connected I and non-I. Now, what is the nature of this connectedness? I do not talk about intersubjectivity. So the way we define subject then enters intersubjectivity. I'm talking about transjectivity and transsubjectivity, and the way this dimension enters subjectivity and the definition of the other. So the matrixial sphere is a space of encounters and their trails. Traces of my traumatic encounters with my non-I occurring along unconscious pathways opened by originary encounter event. So here's another passage I'm doing. Instead of thinking about thing that then is transformed into object or even lacking object, the passage from thing to object, I say no, right from the beginning, we can call the primordial event an encounter event. And therefore the passage would not be from thing to object, but from encounter event, which is an archaic modus, into different kinds of encounter event. And psychoanalysis and the relation with the patient is for me an encounter event in the sense that it is also takes place in time. Not every encounter is an encounter event, and not every event becomes so meaningful and so transformative in potential. When there is the transformative potentiality, there is an encounter event which plays with time. One of the things that I hope to do in this, in our seminar, is also talk about time and the way how we appreciate future enters the field of interpretation of what we are doing with one another at every moment, every therapeutic moment, but every moment in general, and what is the position of how can we refigure the future time in the process, in the analytical process. So I'm talking about an originary thing encounter, thing event, or finally encounter event. And the way that traces of encounter eventing are working within us, with us, within us, with others, in a way for which any notion of definite castration and total other doesn't work. And therefore it is not, the matrixial is not on the side of the feminine and not all non-relations, but is beyond, it's the feminine which is beyond the four positions of sexuality that Lacan offers. We shift the paradigm, we move forward from it. And for me, one of the topological form which is always with me, and I work with it a lot, is the double conch. How do you call it? The conch, this one. You can start to follow from here and it will go there where we don't know. But you can start, for example, from here and see what goes on if you work like this and enter from here and come from there and imagine, I prepared for you, I might bring them later, all these conch when they are connecting. Now, why this topology of the seashell is so interesting? It is because we can imagine that when we put them next to one another, what will be connecting is not interconnection, but transconnection, in the sense that the resonance of the one will influence the resonance in the other, that whatever, if I pass the air through it, the way the air passed through it can pass through the other, yes or no. And what is important in that is that in the matrixial, we do not imagine a form which is one, which is only one. Il y a de l'un, we did not talk about it. We will not talk about it today, but there is the one, the subject, and its oneness is problematic. So, let me present to you something more when we talk about the topological forms in Lacan, the torus, the klein bottle, the cross cup. Yeah, we know that we have a shape, and what Lacan is doing with this shape, he relates to the edge of the shape. For example, a cross cup is like this. And then to the possibility that each point can relate to another point. And then you can start to fold them. And if you fold them, this point here now is close to this one. Like this, they were separate. So the forms are, in fact, he relates to in order to show that at each point, a point from the imaginary can touch the symbolic in this way or in that way, or the symbolic can define that which will be excluded as real in this way and that way, etc. There are different ways. But in the end, it is all about how the subject constructs itself vis-a-vis the fantasy. The object A belongs to the fantasy. So what are we talking about when we say that these kind of shapes gets their final definitive moment when there is an interpretation or a cut, and they become flattened like a disk, and then we can identify inside, outside, and so on. One of the things that I try to put into our understanding is the major difference between the articulation of the primal scene and the Oedipus complex. And in fact, one of the things that occurs in the transformation is a way to come from our position, which is already Oedipal. Guess what is the position of the primal scene, or take from the primal scene and do some intervention in which we discover other formats and other positioning of the subject vis-a-vis its fantasy. And the crucial thing is that in the Oedipal, in the most symbolic way, in the Oedipal positioning, it is possible to imagine this subject, that subject, the paternal subject, the maternal subject, me, them, objects, and I, in this formula of castration, I become when I succeed to put them off. This structures the primal scene, which was before, as symbiosis. But is it symbiotic? With the question of with the matrixal, we can show that it had never been symbiotic. Now, the structure of the subject in this primal scene entails the recognition that I cannot totally reject the maternal, the paternal in order to become, because I would not come. I would not have been born. It's retroactive, right? I would not have been born if I am rejecting this kind of a formula in which this jointness was necessity for life. So to imagine the subject starting with a kind of either autistic positioning or symbiotic positioning, then establishing itself through castration is already a denial of the importance of the primal scene, whatever it is. Because this is the question I endlessly will ask myself, how come that I have come to this life? With the matrixal, the importance for me is on the imaginary level is pregnancy, so that we realize that on very many different levels, also kinesthesia, also proprioception, I don't know how to say it in English. The moment I realize whatever it is that can become a part of my subjectivity, I am already transconnected through all kinds of vibrations and resonance. I'm not alone, and I'm not aspiring to this total cut. So I'm going to read slowly, at least that we have one example of how the topological form serve the Lacanian thinking. And from that we can think also about other topological forms. Lacan explains the relations in fantasy of the subject to the object A in terms of topological surfaces such as flattenable disk aplatissable, I translated like that, I don't know how to translate it, and the Mobius stripe in all the shapes that we showed, which they combine to form a cross cup. The cross cup is particularly interesting. You know, it is structured from it's a development of how when you put a bottle klein together, it doesn't matter the mathematics of it. And we don't need geometry it doesn't matter so much. What we need to understand is that there is a continuity between subject and object that appear at a certain moment. At a certain moment, we can realize one side or the other only if we performed a cut on the shape. That's the major point. These topological surfaces are analogous, for example, and here I put it in the domain of the gaze, to the gaze, which is the object, right? The subject, and the projective plan. The projective plan, think of it as a screen, think of it as an internal screen of dreaming, and you can also think of it as painting. For me, the most easy metaphor is painting, but also other forms of art. Just as the properties of each of these surfaces can only be perceived from another dimension, this is why it needs to be projected on another plan if we want to perceive it. Psychological functions analogous to them can only be envisioned after a phallic cut has been made in a global, and I quote, undifferentiated fabric. So that which is before, the symbiosis, is imagined as undifferentiated and undifferentiable. It's like Esther Beek in the British tradition. It has a lot of parallels in the thinking of Bion and of other analysts. So there is a cut in the undifferentiated fabric, which transforms it into a cross cap. It have not been before that moment, this topological shape projected. This fabric, Lacan calls it sometimes bubble, is the other, the imagination of the other. And what I call other as woman or body situated in that location of the archaic mother, M/big O. So it's not the other of the chains of the signifiers. It's not the symbolic other, but is a reference to an archaic other encounter eventing, from which we had to differentiate ourselves and become different, but keeping the same path for transconnecting to others just as well. On the partial level, not on the level of full subject standing in front of another full subject, but on that level where limits are crossed and where trauma can occur, but also therapeutic transformation can occur. The bubble, okay, or this undifferentiated fabric, where what we later become the subject is intermingled then to begin with the archaic other. To begin with, the future subject is immersed in the other, big O, in fusion with her, of necessity her. It's perhaps the only moment where we can talk about her without relating to gender. It's not gender. It's not the her of gender. It's not, it is this body as it is transconnected to us, inseparable from my perception of whatever I can see as I. Even though there is an inside and an outside of the bubble, it is not possible to orient by them and to distinguish reality from desire. What are primitively flip sides in the location of the other, says Lacan, plays heads or tails, like the two sides of a coin. However, there's no way concerns the subject. There is no way a concern for the subject because for Lacan, there is not yet a subject. The subject begins with the cat. This is what Lacan tells us. So what we see here as the object little a and what we see here as the topological form transform themselves into our positioning vis-a-vis the phantasmatic objects. A cut out, eliminated substance, establishing a total change in the structure of the bubble. This is the object A. And it's important here because if I say the object and object A already comes from a thing, then it has been produced through that structure of the cut. The cut is necessary for that. We will receive something else if we will have another procedure of interference or of engaging. The moment that the object A, the gaze or the voice is a very, very interesting object. I dedicated to it some papers in the past. It's very interesting. The object A is cut out and falls away from the fabric. We have a bubble, a fabric, undifferentiated. The surface itself is transformed. That's the point. When you cut any Mobius stripe or any Mobius shape, the surface is transformed. It is not anymore the surface of that topology. Its properties as cross-cup are revealed, while what remains becomes a flattenable disk with distinct flip sides, a recto and a verso, or a right side up and an underside, so that it is no longer possible to pass from one to the other without crossing or leaping over an edge, which is something which is not possible. And that Lacan puts it like that, the edge created by subtracting the object A. This objet étranger, this strange object, is precisely what makes such a leap impossible. So I would like now to jump a little and to talk about the difference, and also for us when we listen to our patients, we have to identify when, not only when we are on a, we are hovering around a structure where there is more definitions, it's more Oedipal, let's say, and not only pre-Oedipal, but the primal screen, which is not the pre-Oedipal, which is prior to anything that I have been connected to, but is meaningful to my becoming human. I want to ask you, all of you, but especially Danielle, if you'd like me to go a little more deep into the topological structure and explain a bit more Lacan, or would you like to move on into more into my own recent work on the death drive and life drive and
Sure.
Because of course we can go very deep, but I can also send, for all those who wishes, I can send the papers I'm reading from I can take it from my computer and to see how it is built, you know, very slowly.
Mm-hmm.
in order to explain the relations between the I and the gaze, and the I and the non-I, subject and object, and so on. All this is a very, very slow work in the in a certain, or we can move on a bit to the situation now, and how anymore we cannot anymore talk about I, gaze, and screen, because now the symbiosis is I, screen, gaze, which includes us. It's like a fractal, the I versus the screen, gaze, and myself, working on the path, exploiting, I would even say, our libidinal structures, exploiting our narcissism, and how to make the difference between the screens that we have now to deal with, the object that we have now to deal with. And so there is inside my head the competition between continuing with Lacan or moving
to the
matrixial gaze.
Okay, I think we would like to proceed more on your work, not Lacan as much, but if you are going to join us next week, we have more time. So however you feel appropriate. I'm thinking also the two are very related. So I know there are questions even now based on what you've already presented. So would you like a couple questions now, and then you can go? Is that okay? Or would you like to hold questions?
I think I should give some more material.
First, okay.
I think I should give some more material. And if the questions were not answered by what I'm going to give.
Very good. So I think
more fast.
Everyone seems to think that we should continue to talk about gaze and screen now, and then we can loop back to the Lacanian questions when it's appropriate.
Okay, that's all right. I'm going to also to relate it to the feminine, because this is going to be useful. In Lacan's teaching in the 70s, as we all know, the topological sphere joins the feminine as real, as inaccessible to knowledge, clearly pointing to woman beyond the phallus. Lacan did not abdicate the kingdom of the phallus until the end of his teaching, even though he tried. From this perspective, the woman and her sexual relation will always remain an impossible other. It is the spheric, I'm quoting, it is the spheric topology of this object called A, projected on the heterogeneous other of the composite that the cross cup constitutes, okay? So now I'm going if I'm going to move to the question of the gaze and the eye and the screen in the matrixial, I will further talk a little about that plane or sphere. The matrixial unconscious sphere is, I call it a border space of simultaneous co-emergence and co-fading of the I with the non-I, which is not yet cognized. So we can talk in terms of partial subjectivity, we can talk about moments, we can talk about links to the fragmented me and partial subject, partial object. But what is not possible, like in the pregnancy metaphor, is fusion and symbiosis, and what is not possible is a total rejection. This composite produces share and transmit, therefore, joint, but also diffracted and also hybrid object of gaze, okay? So we have to think about the link as conductible, like resonance, between I and non-I. I'm talking about this kind of intimate sharing and not fusing, where differentiation doesn't happen with the cat, but it happens through attunement of distance in proximity, and continual reattunement. And for that, I elaborated a group of mechanisms that I realize happen in these impossible relations, and where metonymic or metaphor do not hold, cannot account for. So it's another group. For the moment, let's call them metamorphosis. We cannot have time to get into that. So we are negotiating relations without relating on the borders of appearance and disappearance, on the borders of subject and object, and also among subject and partial subjects, and to create a language that we can share. When I talk about the resonance between subject object, I call that resonance linking sphere. I talk about transjectivity, transjectivity, which is not inter. And when I talk about subject and partial subjectivities, I talk about the transsubjectivity, because I make the difference, as you see, between whatever it is that we can relate to as object and whatever it is that we can relate to as subject. And there is a certain claim that not everything that we define as non-I can enter the category of object or can become an object. That this is a mistake in the perspective, or this is only one perspective. And there are other perspectives as well. Especially if you want to think about the possibility of creativity and art, and the difference between creativity and art. Because creativity is a domain which does not need necessarily to assume ethics. Artworking is not aesthetics, is not pure creativity. Art working occurs between ethics and aesthetics. Okay, so it's not about creativity, it's not just co-emergence. We have to realize the relations that occurred in our way to become a subject, and also retroactively through the primal sin, as a kind of incest that is not sexual and that cannot be avoided. Body to body coming together cannot be avoided, but is not to be, put aside as sexual, because it's not. There are other kinds of relations that are not, cannot be considered sexual, and yet they are transgressive. And our transconnectivity is transgressive. And that's one of the points, how to realize this transgression that occurs all the time and transform them into creativity and not into traumatic event, and not put them in the basket of sexuality. Therefore, few categories cannot serve in the way we know them, and majorly we cannot preserve the category of for the feminine. We cannot preserve, for example, the category of perversion as such, because it demands a certain definition of an object and then a certain transgression, which is very different from the transgression I'm talking about. Let's go to the more deep to the gaze, to the question of oops. There's a lot of homework, you see, and I cannot find myself. Okay. So we will take it from another point of view. I want to read to you a little passage that I wrote about Narcissus of Caravaggio. Do you know the painting Narcissus of Caravaggio? This is Caravaggio looking at himself in the water, looking for its reflection. And in the reflection, we don't see anymore this beautiful young man, but we see old person. And
Bracha, would you like me to share the image? I can share it.
Yes, this
Okay.
will be fantastic.
Give me just one moment.
Okay. That's it. Great. Leave it on the screen. So death, in my view, death is what in Caravaggio's Narcissus, searching loving gaze through its own image in the water mirror, finds. Death does not reflect Narcissus' lasting eyes, but rather gazes at him. And we know that in the definition of Lacan, it is the gaze that looks at us and forms us as that which is lost from us. Here, well before the era of Freud's unconscious uncanny, not eros impels the self-lover eyes, but thanatos. Death drive supplies the psychic energy for the veiled spell of death. For Freud, the projection of an impulse to gaze, repressed under aggressive tendencies, induces the double as a persecutory imaginary instance, source of anxiety. Caravaggio's Narcissus, autoerotic kneeling before oneself, renders a spectral image of decay. Intuitively and logically, this figure is perceived as Narcissus' after image. Yet in my view, it rather absorbs and returns the painter's fore image, the unconscious carrier of his vision, his invisible subject matter. A visual sign that symbolizes afterlife appears when my eyes follow the trajectory of Narcissus' transformation of the knee. Look at his knee. This potent phallic symbol, central source of enigmatic luminosity in the painting, into a memento mori mark form, hinting that the lasting gaze of Thanatos looks from the painting's unconscious, retroactively says through a future painting of Caravaggio as well, San Girolamo, where replica of this blurred color form
You gotta come.
transmutes into a skull. Beauty in Narcissus, in the painting, is the phantasmatic screen that hides the gaze that asks us to remember our human mortality. For Freud, repetition is a major manifestation of death drive. It testified to its activation. If psychic narcissistic gaze is a result of primary separation from the archaic mother, M/big O, repressed according to trajectories of castration anxiety, the eye of Narcissus and the gaze he longs for remain forever split. And this gaze can only appear accompanied by sheer anxiety in the form of the double, dusk of a self, aggressively projected into rejected otherness, split to avoid symbiosis with the mother, conceived as death and self-annihilation, where grave and womb are fused through the lenses of historically transmitted cultural confusion. Uncanny anxiety aroused by art opens an interval from such sheer anxiety. With Caravaggio, we see that before the modern conception of narcissism, that we know from Freud, one can only love itself, or one can only love the one who protects the self, or one can only love its ego ideal, etc. The concept of subject as a being towards death, like Heidegger, and beauty as a barrage from death, like Lacan, a similar crystallization of subject here appears in a nutshell, along a masculine cultural filiation that reflects father-son internalized relation. In contemporary terms, Caravaggio unveils fascination as a deadening freeze, what Lacan called fascinum, the gaze that freezes, that catches us and freezes life, that kills us. The narcissistic wound of the figure is transparent, but its ideal and the failure of this ideal is visible. It condemns the subject to isolation, during self-abandonment to autoerotic longing. And we can think about Lacan and his talks about the jouissance of the one and how autistic it is and how there is no relation. To use Lacanian terms now to address psychic life, the gaze directed from the object of the gaze to the subject, to its eyes, is projected on a phantasmatic internal screen. This internal screen of fantasy can, up to an extent, be compared to an exterior screen, the film, the video, the digital screens, taken as metaphors for the relations between passion and desire. Eye and gaze can never meet, except on a phantasmatic screen. If they meet in the real, this will happen through a psychotic undifferentiation in the form of hallucination, symbiotic fusion, where the self appears and in a paranoidical delusion. I will move now to the idea, I will briefly say, that certain social digital media, not like Zoom in my view, because it has another function, but like Facebook and Instagram and the like, there is a fusion that is offered to the subject and is actualized through the subject. And I refer to it as digital stupor, to the cumulative effect of digital social media and digital games, and not to the question of the virtual as such. Now, what is the digital stupor rather than anxiety? It's not anxiety. It means stupefaction, state of senselessness, amazement, unconscious torpor and insensibility, some kind of coma. Digital stupor is the result of overwhelmedness and inundation, of a cumulative instance of inundation in the endless plasticity and endless multiplication of the screens. So there is a moment which is the symbiosis, eye, gaze, and screen, which is addictive and which takes the form, which exploits the form, which drives on the forms that we all know of the relations between subject and fantasy and the lanes, the path of narcissistic desire. So we can speak of a stupor and not as trauma because of the kind of time it engages. And since the phenomenon here is of obsession with immediate jouissance, which, like in the painting of Caravaggio, this obsession give rise to death drive. That we can talk then about a fused gaze screen in symbiosis with the psychic eye that envoids, that empties desire. So we can see that the idea that we cannot move on anymore with the idea that if we take some symbiotic situation and we produce a cut in it, we can transform something. The digital screen, for example, fused with the qualities of an unconscious gaze that joins our phantasmatic threads, become a subjectivizing agency, an eye gaze screen that controls the subject who becomes its object, that is us. In a digital stupor, and even contrary to the classical Caravaggio, narcissism and death drive manifest themselves together in the passing out of the humanized past and the crumbling of the humanized future. Now I'll present a little the matrixial possibility, which can be also serve as a resistance. Matrixial non-symbiotic gaze within screen, non-symbiotic eye gaze screen, but gaze within screen. We'll talk about it. This is an idea that I wrote about in 1996, and all these media we're talking about did not exist yet. We hardly had a mobile telephone by then. I'll just say a few words about the possibility of the gaze and screen, then we move to question, okay? It's okay? So non-symbiotic gaze within screen can differentiate itself by awareness, becoming aware to the deadening affective numbness that accompanies the fusion between the eye, the phantasmatic screen gaze, and the real virtual screen gaze. I'll explain. The phallic web of webs uses and can in principle abuse our primordial matrixiality. So I think there is a need to understand the matrixial beyond the phallus so that we become aware of it and we will not allow this big screen other play with us on our own ignorance and knowledge. Abuses our primordial matriciality, our capacity for self-relinquishment and concern, and even compassion. The awareness to the matricial, then, to our affective transsubjectivity and transjectivity that enables our alliances, can become a way of resistance. In a matricial, non-symbiotic differentiation of that which is I and non-I, the I, the screen, the gaze, the human freedom even can appear like that. It's a freedom rift, which cannot be tied to the entirely new or to the entirely newness, imaginary of a newborn. I'd like to say something about the gaze again and finish with that for the moment. And if we have time, we will say more. And a very early definition that I gave to that possibility of matricial differentiation, I said that the phallic gaze, its definition, excites us while threatening to annihilate us in its emergence on the screen. The symbiotic gaze invites us to sink inside it while threatening to annihilate us together with the screen. So both of them cannot serve for us. The matricial gaze thrills us while making us aware that we are participating in a drama which is wider. Our subjectivity is a drama which is wider than our own individual self. I can have eyes and not see, have ears and not hear. The gaze can see you without eyes. I can look at you without seeing you. This is the situation of the gaze screen right now. Gaze, look, and seeing are different notions. Seeing, listening involves senses coordinated with affects on the one hand and ideas on the other hand. So, since we don't have a lot of time and I want to take questions and then maybe return or decide where we take the discussion, whether we take it to the gaze and screen or to the feminine matricial or to, then I will say one thing, which is very important, I think, that when we move from Freud to Lacan and to the matricial, there is one major change, which is the understanding not of death drive, but of life drive. When we read Freud, and also Lacan, and also Deleuze and Guattari, we see that there is a major acceptance of a certain idea of life drive, which is patterned upon the life drive of a unicell or amoeba, or Lacan has a wonderful passage that I analyzed where in fact this object A is a kind of friction of a life drive, right? This is when he starts to balance back the theory and try to formulate the object A from the real towards the symbolic and not the other way around, not as a lack, but as a entity. He gets it upon the path of life drive, and life drive is this amoeba and these unicells splitting themselves, this element in us which moves from person to person and lives forever and represent immortality. In the contemporary language, it will be the genes, the DNA. So we are the objects of this life drive that uses us in order to continue forever and ever over the generations. And when we look at it in details, we realize that nothing from that definition of life drive takes into account the humanizing life on Earth. And so therefore, we get, in all the different theories, we get death drive that motivates us. And when it is a life drive, it remains in the service of our DNA's structures. And this is very important if we want to rethink human subject in terms of the feminine and the matrixial and the maternal, then in bringing into account the pregnancy, the fact that we are co-emerging in psychic terms, and that this is a dimension all along and between we are born and we die, then we are dealing with addition, also a transformation to the idea of life drive, which already accompanies us for almost 130, 40 years. We can do some step forward. I can stop here and take questions.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to hear you develop these threads. I don't want to, I have questions myself, but we also have questions from the chat. And again, since I think so many of us are very engaged with this presentation, it's probably best that you raise your hand. I think by now you know how to do that. You click on the reactions tab down below, and then you press hand. Why don't we start with Wilfred, who has a question on the Lacanian notion of mirror stage and some of the earlier comments that you made. Okay, go ahead,
Sure.
Wilfred.
So could one not say that one of the very early theories of Lacan, the mirror stage, gave to the gaze, but he didn't call it the gaze, but to the gaze, the crucial function of the baby to realize that the body parts belong to a unified body?
Absolutely, of course. The mirror stage was very crucial in terms of the drive, the scopic drive, that through the mirror, I mean, my feeling of myself is of necessity partial and mixed, and I cannot have an idea that all these feelings and emotions and affects and events, they are all belong to one entity, which becomes the subject. And for the early Lacan, it is the moment, it's also the moment in development. It's not only in a structure, but a developmental moment where I could see that I have these limits and so on. So the gaze is the early gaze in the early Lacan is a structuring formula which allows these parts of me to put themselves together. But as time goes on, we can see it also as a metaphor. And also what we saw with the four concept of psychoanalysis in '64, we see a very important new stage. So when I say as a metaphor, we can also say that the regard, the look of the outside into me, the reflection that the outside gives to me structures me just as well, collecting my bits and parts into that entity that is then defined not only through the mirror, but the mother as a mirror, the father as a mirror, the environment as a mirror. So the metaphor, the mirror stages, it's also a metaphorical understanding that from the outside will come whatever it is that will calm me and collect me together. But then in 64, Lacan meets new problems, and especially what we see is the importance of the lack of that which is not becomes more and more and more important. So it's not only that the reflection in the mirror is not a real me, it's a virtual me reflected. It is also that what structures me is that which disappears. If we take it historically with Melanie Klein, the object that defines me and shapes me and contributes me as a subject is the present object. The good breast, the bread, the good breast participate in the story. When we go to Bion, and I think that Bion influenced Lacan, I remarked it in different places, the object becomes when it disappears. So the meaning of the good breast is not when the breast is here, but when it is no longer here. Here we have the echo of loss, and loss is still developmental, it happens in time. So when Lacan wants to move, not to emphasize not development, but structure, he does not talk about loss anymore. The object is not that which we lose. The object is lacking from the beginning by definition. So what is the real in the early Lacan, in the period we talk about? Anything that the symbolic cannot reflect to us, cannot capture for us, cannot interpret. Therefore, the lack is in the structure. And lack and loss are not the same thing. The thing could have been always lost when the subject appears. So the subject has no way to address that. And this is why I said there is a development in Lacan, which is very important. It's important to see what period we read, because in the very late Lacan, he's trying to say the object, that the real is not only that which is lacking, but also that kind of present jouissance for which we cannot give any words and no definition can capture it. And so you see there is this movement in the definition of the gaze and its place in becoming a subject.
Very good. Next we have Andrew. Please.
Oh, first of all, thank you so much. This is really very illuminating and very fascinating. You opened a lot of different areas. Particularly, I really found the section that you closed on, the stupor of the screen digital world today, fascinating area that we could just discuss in itself. And but I'd like to go a little bit back earlier to some of the subjects that you opened up, where you were talking about, let me see if I can get back to this, the structure of how fantasy works with subjectivity. And you, if I may say, I want to give a little more, I'm going to just get right to the point, what the role of essentially the phallus is in the way you're theorizing here. And what I mean by that is by way of talking about Lacan's seminar, which is translated in English to or worse. It's called Or Worse. And there's a wonderful passage in it where he's describing a scene, an everyday situation, whereby people walk around the streets and they encounter different people and they go to a store and buy a croissant or whatever. And it's all just a kind of flow of interactions and signifiers, and it's all a kind of confusion of interactions, and everything's just a kind of confusion, essentially. You don't know what's going on. And the only point in which you feel something between people is at bottom, a negotiation of where is the phallus. What really is happening between people comes down to something, not that you're going to have sex with the person, but something of a question of a flirtatious moment, something of, at bottom, something of a moment of a question of where is the phallus. I'm being a little crude right now. It doesn't necessarily come down to sexuality. It could come down to all kinds of negotiations of meaning. So that could be something like you're in a hospital, for God forbid that doesn't happen to anyone here, but you do make choices of which nurse or doctor you prefer, because there's a certain, as you said, humanist element of meaning between you and the other, where you are in fact negotiating a certain interaction of meaning around words and interaction of change that does have something to do with, I'll call it the phallus, of signifying what's important. So where I'm questioning here is that you in your exposition have described castration as total annihilation, as more or less total castration. And what I'm trying to understand is what the role in sort of the period we're in now, where we could generally describe as decline of the paternal order, is it really, we're seeing a situation where it's adequate to describe, certainly generally, a period of the not all of the emergence of different ways of articulating feminine sexuality, et cetera, or et cetera. But is it, how do we describe or articulate the role of essentially the phallus in a certain sense within this horizon, and in effect within the clinical situation, or indeed in how we describe or discuss cultural or political phenomena? Indeed, when you were describing, for example, the stupor of the political atmosphere of the media world, et cetera. So it just enters into a lot of different situations that I just wanted to open up that discussion, that's all, really. And I'd see if you could explore that a little bit further.
Okay, this is a fantastic question, because it's very important to say right from the beginning that the phallus is not the penis.
No, sure, absolutely.
For Lacan, and for Lacan, there is, we can say that the structure, the phallic structure, has a certain privilege when you are male, because it might correspond to a certain, well, for many, many reasons. But that's not the point. We know the famous formula where he said that the imaginary phallus, each one of us must lose. We can joke about it and say that it's more difficult to lose what you imagine you have than what you imagine you don't have. But in any case, from the beginning, for Lacan, the phallus is symbolic and the phallus is imaginary as well. And we are not talking about body, and we are not even talking about sexuality. But there is a difference between Lacan in Upir, which is a very late seminar, quite a late seminar, and Lacan in the beginning, because in the beginning, well, when he starts, the location of the phallus is indeed, the important location is in the symbolic, and it refers to meaning, even to linguistic meaning. It refers to interpretation. It refers to how we how language is used in order to reorganize, yeah, instead of the mirror, to reorganize our experiences and so on. And then, therefore, this a certain amount of organization, which he calls the phallus, must be present at every stage. When I talk about other processes, or when I talk about metamorphosis, I'm not replacing metaphor and I'm not replacing metonymy, and the matrixial does not replace the phallus. It's a word which is here to describe a field with its concepts. Now, castration and the phallus is not the same. Castration is the mechanism that is used in order to organize in a phallic way, which means that it takes us to the field of meaning and how meaning is indeed reaches us. Now, we might say that meaning can be created in all kind of different way, but for Lacan, it's very specific. Now, what is so amazing, when you read Lacan, you see how first the phallus is there in the symbolic, and the imaginary phallus, it doesn't matter. You know, the way you identify yourself as man or woman in relation to the phallus, it doesn't matter. Even later on, we all have then relation to the phallus as woman, as man, as avoiding it, rejecting it, accepting it, melting with it, and so on. But what is so amazing is how we, without us realizing it, we move from seminar to seminar. The phallus starts to occupy just any place of sense possible. So first it occupies the meaning that is, and that which is not escapes it as an object. And then it also starts to occupy that which is not. Then we have the -5. Then it starts to occupy every moment. In my writing, I make the difference between when I talk about sense and meaning becomes very important in my formulation, and how to move from sense to meaning is very important, and not only from meaning into the rest of it, because if the phallus defines the meaning, it doesn't define male or masculine.
Sure.
It says that whenever we want to understand, we are in the hands of that structure, and phallus, the castration is its preferable mechanism. So what Lacan is doing, he says, I don't care how you call it. What you might put a ping pong ball instead of the oral or the anal or the breast or the penis or whatever you want. Whenever you use the castration mechanism, you produce a phallic meaning.
Indeed.
Therefore, I'm not fighting the phallic meaning. I'm saying this kind of meaning attribution and this kind of mechanism that works through rejection is blind to other kinds of mechanism of sense making and sense giving in that universe. And it's not about rejecting the phallic orchestration, it's about other ways of making sense and giving sense. And when we say that, when Lacan says that when I'm already walking in the, he does not mean who has the power. Phallus also became equivalent with power, which is, and he doesn't necessarily, of course, doesn't mean who flirts with whom. He means what thread will I pull in order to give meaning to this balagan we say in Hebrew, to this total confusion over overwhelming set of information. I'm going to go this way or that way, and I'll give meaning through whatever is already in the structure, of course, of my own fantasy of what the other is, what the object is, and how I can relate. So what is the me and you? Is the other not me, or is it a non-I, which is not rejected from the I?
This is what I'm trying to drive at, because I feel like there's something of an impasse here at this point, theoretically, because indeed, I don't know that let's say if we're talking about the stupor of the media world, if you're a QAnon person, let's just hypothetically imagine we're QAnon people, and we're taking in all the media, every possible thing that comes in on the media, all conspiracy theories out there, and we absorb every single one, and we want to flow with every fantasy possibly out there. That will not resolve the problem of understanding what knowledge to identify with. We will just be some psychotic space then. We might have some fantasy with it, that we're identifying with it, but we're not anywhere located anymore than we were before in some 1955 fantasy that we're a solid man or a good girl. There's no solution that way through an illusion of some oneness with all the
So exactly. So what you say is also, well, this paper on the stupor, of course, is long, and I can send it or that this theory is not sufficient. Even Lacan of the 70s could not imagine, and the structure of subjectivity that he offered could not be enough for what we experience. When I started to write the matrixial sphere, it's not the film Matrix. 10 years before I wrote a theory and a book on the matrix, it was already to explain what kind of webs we can create, which would be still keeping the affect and another kind of meaning and so on, and how it is related to after the feminine in Lacan, and in order to give other possibilities, other maps to read into a universe which in a sense is more and more actualized now. And I talked about the web of webs. There was no web. We didn't have internet, but it was already clear to me what are the lacunes in the theory, both Lacan and Freud, and that how we move forward. And moving forward doesn't mean we are throwing away everything before, or we cannot even throw not the paternal and maternal and and not even the phallus, but we have to understand that it changed shapes. And up until the end, in the writing of Lacan, I went over all of that. He's still nominating every possibility of meaning under the wings of phallus castration and all of that, even when he talks about the continuity of one another and the topological forms and so on. We can talk on another occasion on this, the plates in these forms like this, you know, in the writing of Lacan, which are later than the topological, and how we can transform that into, go beyond that to explain contemporary subjectivity and subjectivity. So it's not Oedipal, but it's not anti-Oedipus either. The matrixal is not here and not there. Okay. It's about the severalities.
For purpose of time, Andrew, this has been really nice thread. I think you've hit, and questions have emerged after Andrew's intervention. One of them, I think, can be answered fairly quickly, perhaps, and it is the following. I'll just read it to you. Is the matrixial logically prior to the phallic, or just chronologically prior? And if is there something like a matrixial explanation for the appearance of the phallic order? I know that's actually a hard question, but maybe you could, for purpose of time.
I would say it like that. That if we take the transconnectivity on the level of fantasy, on the level even of trauma. Imagine for that, the very late pregnancy, for example, where some senses are already functioning, where if the baby is born, it will be alive. So it's not symbiotic, it doesn't need the maternal to live. If we think about ways of sensing the I and non-I in a very pre-subjective ways, starting from that, I would say that already we can see different dimension quite earlier. If it would be developmental, it is before any phallic possibility even exists. We are not in symbiosis and then formulated ourselves through rejection, but we are transconnecting and getting all kind of senses. You know, there was a moment when I know that in neurosciences people spoke now some years ago about the mirror and so on. There are activities in one mind that penetrate another mind, and we have to imagine there's, I call strings, this direct, real vibration, and I call threads, they're already more conceptual or more meaningful, attentivity to these strings. So it is logical to assume priority. So the primordial situation is not multiple, but it's several. It is two at least. Could be in principle 3 or 4 or 5. It couldn't be in principle 1, and it couldn't be in principle endless fragmentation. The matrixial cannot come from that. It is another dimension. And in my formulation, no doubt, what is later called the phallic develops and is stronger.
Mm-hmm.
The matrixial continues all our life, but it remains more fragile.
Mm.
It remains more vulnerable. It collapses under extreme stressful situation when the human animal goes to itself. And I also would say that we can come in contact with it only if we fragilize ourselves and let a bit melt the boundaries which relates only to here is my body, my body in the mirror stage. To start to recognize also, in order to put yourself in a relation to the vulnerability of somebody else, you need to self-fragilize yourself and lose a bit of your control, of your power, this is for artists, it's, for me as an artist, as a painter, it's very natural to enter a situation where I'm not identifying. But in that way also we can think about society, about the way that we are inspiring one another, or that I could transform that which is traumatic to you and you cannot talk about it, but I have to do it in a certain creative way and compassionate way and all kind of concepts that enter it. Because if I'm in the mood of rejecting and establishing the phallic, my phallic position, of necessity, I will not be able to connect to this more fragile matrixiality that is all the time just as well, in my view, a part of us. So I would not say that this brings birth to the phallic, that this is first, and I would say that it is there, continuing all the time, always, and surely the meaning of that is that we have to understand in a different way the phallic structure itself that we built in order to explain our human life.
Okay, Dimitra, would you go? Try to state quickly if possible.
Yes, okay, thank you. Hello, Bracha. Thank you for,
Dimitar.
hi. It's been so long. Thank you for the great talk. It was very, very interesting, everything on the gaze. And I was thinking, you mentioned in passing that the voice is also a very interesting partial object. And if you could just, quickly just give us some hints.
Yeah. If we start from Lacan, I can find the reference for you. You can find it also. The model of the voice was the shofar. Shofar is that instrument that looks like this from the corn of this animal. And the shofar is like a cry, like music. It penetrates. And what penetrates is the voice beyond the words. We might be talking, but there is all this, let's call it the musicality of our voice, which is the invisible, the unarticulated of our talking with one another. So there is that shofar, there is this musicality and the tonality and of that voice, which is a part, you cannot separate it from the words that are addressed to you. But you can, in your mind, separate it. So he starts with that shofar, with that instrument, in order to explain to us the same thing that need to be understood when we talk about the gaze and the eye. The gaze is not what I see, right? And so the voice is not exactly what I hear, the words that I hear. And in terms, if we start from the matrixial, then the emphasis will be on that, on resonance. And imagine that situation when each one of us in this encounter eventing listen to the same voice. Some of us utter the voice. Some of us only hear the voice. And therefore some of us also speak and hear while I speak, I hear my voice. While you speak, you hear your voice, you also hear, I also hear your voice. So there is this transmission. Where is it, this voice? Who does it belong to, you know? So you have the one and the other, and each partial subject, let's call it like that, absorbs the voice in a way which is already relating to its own field and to the relations and to the resonance we all encounter. And then on the phallic level, each one of us will take it to a very different place, but we can again reabsorb it and use it in a more matrixial way. And so the voice, I remember in very early work, when I wrote about the matrixial gaze, I wrote about the touch, voice and touch, the touching gaze, which is not symbiotic gaze, the touching gaze, the touching voice. And then you have kinesthesia, and then you have, it is not only, if I even take it to the question of Wilfried, it is not only how I relate to one another, to my environment, and it is also how I relate to the river, to the water. If I can listen to the trees, and then am I allowed to speak for the trees, and why and how? So we have to remember there's the metaphor of the voice, but there is the real of the voice. There is the trace of the real of the voice. There is the loss of the voice. And in the later seminars of Lacan, there is a lot of emphasis on what you hear when I speak to you, what you hear from that which is said, and so on. That which is said is not what we are talking about, because it is the fact that we are saying, and the voice and all the affect that accompanies is is blurred through the meaning which we give, which would be then phallic meaning, and that's not negative, not positive. It is a definition of the moment where we cut it from the rest of it. And therefore poetry would be more matrixial. Well, the poetry that I like to read, it can go to true movement in the same time. It must keep its music. Thank you, Dimitra.
Okay, Mark, and then I know others have commented. Maybe I would invite you to speak if you wish. I know Jameson has had a question and Frank and others, but let's start with Mark, and please try to keep it brief because we're already at 2 hours. So I want to.
Okay, yeah, I'll just brief.
Go ahead.
Sorry, 1 second. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. That was really, really interesting. A short comment and then a short question. So your work is a great device to explain our place in the crisis we are currently in with screen capitalism and digitally mediated reactive politics and its opposite. Obviously, we have the hyper-nationalist reconstruction of the phallic father. However, we also see massively creative spaces where the name of the father is collapsed in and given language game groups and whatnot, but this has not led to a state of mass psychosis. It's given over to something else, a proliferation of new potentialities and subjectivities and ultimately progressive politics. I think in some cases, we see the failing of Lacanian analysis to give full expression regarding these new modalities of subjectivity, since it attempts to locate these in the field of sexuation, neuroses, psychoses, perversion, etc. What I'm interested in is the type of enjoyment that keeps people engaged in such digitally mediated politics. In that sense, can we talk of a third term of jouissance regarding your work? We have phallic jouissance, other jouissance, but does matriarchality focus on something else? Another kind of jouissance, one that allows non-relation and relation at the same time. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I suppose it's a remark. It's not really a question, right, Mark? It's a remark, and it's important to say that the question of to what an extent psychoanalysis can account for society and for politics, and it's a very, very, of course, old question, and it's an ongoing question. And also the question whether we can take, how do we understand the collectivity? How do we understand the mass? How do we understand ourselves as subject versus society? Or do we understand ourselves as subject resulting from society? It's obvious for me that Lacan achieved few major steps of development, and then we have to move it on all different levels, including and majorly the social level finally and political level. The questions still remain: what kind of relationalities and break from relationalities we can imagine based on what we understand as the human subjectivity. Because doubtless the human being achieved so much power that they can also destroy the earth, and they might also help to make the earth flourish. So it's not because the human being is better than any other kind of living being on earth, but it is because of this capacity also to destroy that we must pay attention to these domains of the mentality and our psychological capacity. And what is it that allows us to connect or be fascinated by this political figure or another? What are the values that underlie it? In the matrixial sphere, for example, the value, we didn't even start to talk about it, there are implications that to care and carry are important values. So if you decide this is a value, then it also enters the question of what is social value, what we value, what we, and the question of why money is more important than care, or, I put it very bluntly. But of course, I agree with you that we couldn't stay there. We couldn't even stay with the very, very late Lacan.
We have a question from
Thank
Anna.
you.
Thank you, Mark. That was a beautiful testimony, question, comment. Anna asks, I'm going to read it. Can you speak and have you thought about how in the matrixial anxiety is different than in the way Lacan thinks about it vis-a-vis the phallic order and the symbolic order? Could you speak about anxiety briefly?
Yeah, I would say that if any of you would like to read more about the question of anxiety in my work, I can send you papers and you can give it to Anna and to those who are interested. Spontaneously, I will only say one thing, that for Freud, the only primordial affect is anxiety. When I'm thinking in terms of the matrixial and where it is not possible to put subject and object exactly in that same compositions, I realize that there are other primordial affects that very easily enter the affect, become anxiety. But a priori, they have not been anxiety, but they are primary affect. And so we can dedicate a whole chapter to that. But
Yes.
there is a paper called, I think it's easy to get it on the internet, Uncanny Compassion, Uncanny O. So what is this passion, which is passion, and how can it translate itself to anxiety and so on?
I want to invite Frank to say a brief question, and Leslie, if you want to go, Frank, and then Leslie, you can follow, just to preserve time, because I'd like to we may not get to all of the questions today, but I think next week we will be able to. Go ahead, Frank.
Thank you, Bracha. Very wonderful, scintillating conversation. I feel like my question's somewhat moot. If not, it's just a little bit retrograde back to the idea of how to position matrixality and the phallic object. And I'm curious if I understand it correctly, it's the encounter of das Ding that precipitates or catalyzes the transformation of das Ding into the objet A. And the objet A does not really represent the subject as a signifier for another subject being represented by a signifier, but represents something else of a different dimension. I wonder if the objet A then represents constitutive elements of the das Ding, and therefore what we're talking about is that both phallus and matrix are constitutive elements, not in relation with each other so well, perhaps fraughtly, but that's secondary. But does objet A reflect matrix, the matrix and the phallus as elements of das Ding?
I took that a bit one step further also in few articles that I can send you or refer you to, because what I was asking us to do is to allow for a certain differentiation already in the notion of the das Ding itself.
Yes, yeah.
So that what we have is not just that the das Ding, translate into the lacking object, that its only appearance would be our only way to touch it in a sense, which is also relating to our mind and capacity to capture it, will not only be as one possibility that then refracts itself. But imagine that the dusk ding itself had been already structured in like a certain bubble, which is undifferentiated, and to introduce a differentiation in there, it's very difficult conceptually, and that's why I needed to go deeply and understand what is it that serves our great masters like Freud and Lacan and even Heidegger and even before, to understand what would be a life drive.
Thank you.
Because it's as near to how we understand life drive as possible. Okay, so in that way, of course, I took then the structure of the objet A and built what would be a matrixial object A, and how they will negotiate and how they can also capture one another. And at the end of the day, we could look at the phallus matrixially. It's not a contradiction for me because it's another dimension. Which means that we have, for example, understanding even of masculinity, femininity, and so on in the phallic field, and we have another understanding of maleness, femaleness, everything in the matrixial, and then they, of course, negotiate, because in the matrixial sphere, by definition, you cannot just separate it entirely. That's why I said to you, imagine for a moment, instead of saying, okay, object, subject, object, and so on, in continuity and flip sides, imagine that this one must be within this one in order to, you see the structure? That's a kind of, I didn't really put it mathematically, but that's probably
Apology.
At a topology.
Well,
I painted it.
I think we'll do our final question for today, so that folks can enjoy their Sundays. Barbara has asked, thank you, Bracha, for this time today. I have a question. Having to fragilize oneself to contact the matrixial, as you mentioned, artworking can assist. If artworking is done in a communal way, how does that impact the fragilizing experience? Is it more fragilizing or is it less fragilizing to do art in a collective way? Or is it kind of both?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. There is a book that came up recently of, and there's a lot of artists there talking or analyzing matrixially the artwork, and also there's a group of people who are trying to work art in that way. But I would say that in any encounter, there is a certain risk, there is a certain opening that we have to take, and it's a huge question. If we say that already somehow our cultural sphere and our political universe is, I defined it many times in many phenomena, it's like the neutral became paranoiac. That paranoia is generalized, and what could have been just paranoia, we are suspicious, we cannot work with one another, we worry about our ego, and so it became neutral. Became the neutrality of the situation it's transparent, but it's a bit paranoiac. Like we feel that in order to trust, we have to break, go out of ourselves. But yeah, it is self-fragilizing because it challenges our capacity to trust, and it's a question of awareness. Working in a group is one way. In the universe of art, there is this interest subjective, relational phenomena, but it's not necessarily that this interrelation doesn't necessarily mean that we can enter the matrixial sphere. We might even be more afraid, but to be aware of it means that we can take more risks and then forget ourselves. And so there are a lot of groups that work together in performance and so on that I could see that these matrixial possibilities are very alive there. I think it's an interesting way in terms of artists working. On the other hand, and even paradoxically, I came to understand all that I'm talking about from my relation to painting, which is a very long meditative process. And I'm alone, you know, so when I'm alone, I can feel also and come out with all this. And I realize even from distance, all these connectivities and how it works and how we can work with. And it takes, with the painting itself, it takes this self-fragilization. And it's not, if we look in the modern art, if we go into museums and we see how, you know, the bigger the better, more huge, more immersive, more, you know, fantastic is equated with size and so on. We realize that we live in under certain assumption of what is more in, you know, there's no relation between intensity and size of a work, you know. So for me, a lot is understood in my work in my studio. But I think that to work in a group is, you could exercise in reality and see where it takes you. And yeah, we have to understand that the matrixial is not a kind of a paradise. There are other anxieties, there are risks, there are, we risk things that we are not used to think that, you know, we became very suspicious of any trust, you know. So can we rethink trust? In the matrixial, we rethink fascination. Fascination is not just a fascinum, that everything is, you know, the leader is going to control you. Fascination is first thing a baby needs, you know, to get more life in the move. So we probably threw our baby side with the water, you know. There are many things that the society filtered, and psychoanalysis produced a universe, and we have to change that.
Well, I want to, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for this generous and just very penetrating experience to be a part of this moment with you. So we're very honored and grateful, to say the least. And I wanted to ask if you have an idea for any things we ought to read over the course of the next 7 days until we meet again. For next week, is there anything that you would recommend? And you can send it to me and I can share it too. Or if you want to think about it, you can also kind of send me.
No, I was thinking that a very early paper from '92, which is the matrixial gaze, can give a good start, or I will send you. And surely the question of anxiety, right? And it's really up to you. Can you say a word on what we expect for next week? Is it ever people will do their own presentations, or how does it work? Or do you want me to prepare something?
No, I think actually for the for the presentations, we would do a third session. The fact is, you're able to join us. So I think we would want to take advantage of your presence and allow you to maybe leave more time for this question experience, but to continue a kind of lecture, okay? And maybe these two, you know, kind of picking up really on these questions that have been raised would be natural enough, I think, to do. And I would also say I can encourage everyone to write out their thoughts, their questions, maybe that would formulate a response paper by our third session.
We are growing, huh? We are materially growing, web upon web, like that.
Wonderful.
It's my pleasure. I really thank you and for all the questions, and we'll move on. Any of you have this book that maybe we will need to scan at the first chapter? Do anybody has this one?
Mm-hmm. We do.
So perhaps, well, I'll tell you, perhaps we'll scan, or I will, if I find it, one chapter from this one.
Okay.
And I'll give you more material in relation to your questions. And we will move deeper into the matrixial sphere and to how it can be revealed in the processes of analysis and what we do with what would be the principles of working.
Fabulous. Again, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. I'm very, very pleased. So
thank you very much.
Well, and we'll see you in 1 week.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.